Today's mindful moment. Have you ever been told, I don't see color? Or like, completely frozen up when someone brings up race?
Oh, yeah.
It's more common than you think. And honestly, it kind of gets at the heart of how racism keeps going.
It really does. And it's something Robin DiAngelo dives into in her book, White Fragility. She makes this, super thought-provoking argument,
Okay.
that white people getting all uncomfortable talking about race, it isn't just awkwardness, it's actually a defense mechanism. And that defense mechanism ends up keeping racial inequality in place.
Okay, I'll admit that feels kind of backwards at first, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if I'm uncomfortable talking about race, wouldn't that mean I'm more aware of the issue? And maybe even less likely to be racist myself because I'm trying to be so careful.
See, and that's exactly the kind of thinking DiAngelo is pushing back on. She's saying that discomfort, that fragility, it actually keeps us from having those real, honest, conversations about race.
Uh-huh.
And because of that, we don't even take responsibility for how we might be contributing to racism, even if we don't mean to.
So then where does that whole good person, bad person thing fit in? I feel like that comes up a lot.
Totally. DiAngelo calls that the good-bad binary when it comes to racism.
Okay.
It's like this idea that only the people who are intentionally mean, outright hateful are the real racists.
Right.
And that lets well-meaning white people off the hook.
Right. So it's like, well, I'm a good person. I could never be racist. And then you just close the door on any deeper look at how racism actually works. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah, it's a form of denial, right? We get to feel good about ourselves, but we don't actually have to do the work of looking at the ways we benefit from a system that's unfair to others.
Right. It makes me think of that story DiAngelo tells about the white teacher who walked out of a training session when she got feedback on the racial impact of her words.
Yeah.
And then, all her white colleagues are so worried about her, they thought she was going to have a heart attack.
Right.
It's just so interesting to see how much we center white discomfort, even in those situations where it's like, maybe we should be centering something else.
Absolutely. Prioritizing that white discomfort just shuts down those important conversations about race.
I bet a lot of us have been there on some level, even if it wasn't that dramatic. Think about it. Have you ever, had someone point out how something you did had racial implications?
Mm-hmm.
And, did you immediately get defensive?
Oh, yeah.
Feel like you were being blamed unfairly?
Bro.
Or maybe just want to shut the conversation down right there?
Yeah.
DiAngelo would say those are all textbook white fragility.
Totally.
And I think it's important to remember, she's not saying that being defensive or uncomfortable is all there is to white fragility. She's looking at it as a much bigger pattern in our society.
Right. It's like a societal condition.
So let's dig into her actual definition. How does she explain it, point blank?
Well, she describes white fragility as this, a state where even a tiny bit of racial stress becomes unbearable. And that triggers all these defensive moves, like anger, fear, guilt, arguing, silence, even just leaving the situation entirely.
Right. So it's all these different ways of just getting away from that discomfort.
Yeah.
And these reactions, even though we can understand why they happen, they wind up protecting the way things are.
Yeah.
Right? It stops us from actually looking at our own biases and how we might be playing a part in these racist systems, even without meaning to be.
It's a shield that protects white people from having to really deal with racism.
So we avoid the tough conversations, the real self-reflection.
Right. And that's how it becomes part of the system.
And I think one of DiAngelo's most important points is that this isn't just about individual feelings. She ties white fragility directly to systems of power.
Exactly. It's not just a personal thing, it's structural.
So what does that even mean? How does white fragility connect to power?
She's saying that white fragility comes directly from the advantages and privileges that come with being white.
Okay.
Our society is just set up to benefit white people.
Right.
So we develop this sense of entitlement, we deserve to be comfortable when it comes to race.
And anything that shakes up that comfort, anything that makes us question how we see race,
boom, fragility triggered.
Exactly. And then come the reactions, getting defensive, angry, even crying. It's like trying to get back to that feeling of being in control, of being in a position of racial dominance, even if we don't realize that's what's happening.
Totally. It's like a reflex almost.
And this is where it gets really interesting. DiAngelo gives all these specific examples of white fragility in action that I think a lot of people will recognize from their own lives.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things she talks about is white people using self-defense language when race comes up. They feel personally attacked or blamed just for being asked to listen to a different perspective.
It's like, how dare you challenge my worldview?
Right. It's almost like we're so used to being at the center of the conversation about race that any shift in that feels threatening.
Exactly. Like we're losing something we're entitled to.
Another one she points out is white people getting outraged or indignant when someone points out, like, the advantages we get just from being white.
Oh, yeah, that one's classic.
She's like, how dare you say my life is easier because I'm white? I worked hard for everything I have.
And that denial, that refusal to acknowledge our part in systemic racism, that's a huge part of how white fragility keeps racial inequality in place. And it's worth mentioning, DiAngelo also talks about how white women's tears can be used as a weapon in these conversations, especially when they're talking to people of color.
It's a dynamic I've seen happen, and it's pretty powerful how it can derail things.
Right.
What happens is the whole conversation shifts to comforting the white woman who's upset, and the actual issue, the perspective of the person of color, gets totally lost.
Yeah, it's like white women's tears become this, like, trump card.
It really highlights how white fragility can silence and marginalize people of color. It's something we have to be really aware of and actively work against.
Absolutely. This is a good point to, like, take a pause and reflect. Think about whether you've ever done any of these things. What role might white fragility be playing in your own life?
It's a question we all need to be asking ourselves constantly. And DiAngelo takes it even further with this idea of whiteness as property.
Yeah.
And she's not just talking about, skin color here.
Right. She's building on Cheryl Harris's work, this legal scholar who says that whiteness functions like property in our society.
So what does that even mean? How can whiteness be property?
It's like this. Think of it as all those, like, advantages, the rights, the privileges you get just for being white. You didn't earn them, but you benefit from them anyway. And these are often things that people of color are denied. It shows up in education, housing, jobs, even healthcare.
So we're talking about something that's baked into the system itself, not just individual prejudice or bias.
It's woven into the very fabric of our society.
And DiAngelo uses her own experiences to show what these unearned privileges look like in real life. Like, she talks about growing up around mostly white people and segregation just seeming normal. Like it was even seen as a good thing.
And never having to worry about race or if people are judging her based on her skin color.
And how being white is often treated as like the standard, the default for what's normal or human. Like, everyone's experience is the same as a white person's experience.
It's the baseline, the assumed norm.
Which brings us to a big question for everyone listening. How is whiteness operating in your life? What advantages do you have that you might not even think about? These are tough questions, but we have to be willing to grapple with them if we want to really understand how white fragility props up racism.
And it's important to remember that while all racism is harmful, DiAngelo makes this point that anti-blackness has a particularly deep significance here in the U.S.
Yeah, that makes sense given our history, with slavery and the systemic racism that black people still face today. Anti-blackness just feels so, insidious.
Exactly. DiAngelo dives into this, saying anti-blackness is deeply embedded in the white psyche. And one of the things she points out is, like, the way white people project negative traits onto black people as a way to not deal with those traits in themselves.
Oh, wow. So instead of acknowledging, like, our own capacity for negativity, we just project it outwards. And in doing that, we further dehumanize black people in the process.
Exactly. And that projection is, like, amplified by those racist stereotypes we see, those media portrayals that paint black people as dangerous or criminal or lazy. She also talks about that persistent white resentment towards things like affirmative action.
Which, yeah, we kind of touched on earlier. A lot of that comes from just not understanding how affirmative action actually works.
Right. Like, even though there's a ton of evidence of systemic discrimination against black people, so many white people view affirmative action as this, like, unfair advantage given to people of color at their expense.
It's like almost we're more concerned about the perceived slight against ourselves than with, like, literally centuries of oppression and disadvantage that affirmative action is trying to address.
Yeah. It goes back to that discomfort, that fragility we talked about earlier.
Right. It's that feeling of, how could you do this to me?
Exactly. And this all speaks to that ingrained preference for white spaces that DiAngelo brings up. Like, think about it. All that fear and disdain people have for black neighborhoods, it's often fueled by those same racist stereotypes and media representations we've been talking about.
Yeah, that fear often leads to things like white flight, just further segregation of communities. And DiAngelo argues that these segregated white spaces, they're not neutral, you know? They're filled with these racial messages that reinforce a white-centric worldview.
Mm-hmm. And she offers these really powerful examples of how anti-Blackness shows up in, like, everyday life.
Right, and it's those everyday examples that we really need to pay attention to.
Yeah.
Because if we can start to see them, then maybe we can start to, disrupt them.
Totally. And one that she points out is, that whole all lives matter response to the Black Lives Matter movement. On the surface, it seems, harmless enough. But it actually derails conversations about anti-Black racism. Like, it centers the comfort of white people again.
It's almost like saying, let's not focus on the specific issues Black people are facing. Let's just talk about everyone generally. But that completely ignores the systemic inequalities at play.
It's a way of avoiding the hard stuff. And another example she gives is a tendency to judge Black people more harshly and to, like, attribute their actions to these internal flaws rather than to external factors.
So, like, if a Black person is struggling financially, it's their fault, right?
Yeah.
But if a white person's in the same situation, it's just, bad luck or circumstances. It's that lack of giving someone the benefit of the doubt.
It's like this built-in double standard, and we see it playing out in the criminal justice system and education, even just like everyday social interactions.
Yeah, and it all goes back to that point about anti-Blackness being so woven into the fabric of our society.
And DiAngelo also brings up this point about how white people often romanticize the past. And that can actually erase the history of Black oppression. It's that nostalgia for a time when things were better.
But of course, that ignores what life was actually like for Black people back then, right?
Exactly. It's like, those Make America Great Again slogans, they totally gloss over the fact that America was never really that great for people of color.
And this kind of thinking just allows white people to remain blind to the lasting impacts of that history.
Right. So we've talked a lot about the problem of white fragility and how it shows up. But the question is, how do we move beyond it? Like, actually move beyond it?
That's the big question, isn't it? It feels so big sometimes. Where do we even start?
Well, DiAngelo offers some concrete suggestions, and I think the very first step is acknowledging there's a problem. Like, we have to be willing to sit with that discomfort and really examine our own biases.
So, like, confronting that internalized racism we all carry around, recognizing how it affects our thoughts, our words, our actions.
Exactly. And it's like ongoing work. It's not a one-time thing. It takes like constant vigilance and self-reflection.
Right, because it's not enough to just read a book or watch a documentary. It's about really like digging deep and questioning our beliefs and behaviors.
Mm-hmm. And we also need to like educate ourselves, right, about the history of racism, how it still operates today. We need to go beyond those like oversimplified narratives we maybe learned in school and find those diverse perspectives on history.
And there are so many amazing resources out there now, books, articles, documentaries, podcasts.
It's true.
It's really about committing to that process of learning and unlearning.
Because we've all been, socialized in a racist society.
Yeah.
So we've all got work to do to undo that internalized racism.
And another important thing is actually seeking out those diverse perspectives, right? Like building real relationships with people of color.
Yeah. And I mean, that goes beyond just having like one Black friend or a Black colleague. It's about actively engaging with people of color in meaningful ways, listening to their experiences, and being willing to like challenge our own assumptions.
So yeah, getting out of our comfort zones and really engaging with the world in a more, thoughtful, nuanced way.
It's about building those relationships based on respect and understanding.
Yeah. And being open to learning from people who have different life experiences.
Exactly. And finally, DiAngelo talks about how important it is to challenge racist behaviors and structures in like our everyday lives, our personal and professional spaces.
So that's speaking up when we see racism happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
Advocating for policies that are equitable.
Yeah.
Supporting organizations that are fighting for racial justice.
Right. It's about understanding that dismantling racism is like an ongoing thing. It takes effort. It takes vigilance.
So it's not just about not being racist ourselves.
Right.
We have to be actively working to dismantle those systems that keep racism in place.
It's about using our privilege to make a difference.
Absolutely. And that's something we all can do, no matter our background, no matter our social position. We all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world.
That's what DiAngelo is calling for.
So with all that in mind, I want to ask you, the listener, a question. What does all of this mean for you? What can you do in your own life to challenge white fragility? What books are you going to read? What conversations are you going to have? What organizations are you going to support?
These are the questions we should all be asking ourselves.
This has been like seriously eye-opening. And honestly, it feels like we've only just scratched the surface of all this, you know?
Oh, for sure. There's always more to uncover, but I do think we've laid down some good groundwork for like understanding white fragility and what it means for our society.
Okay, so let's try to recap some key takeaways from our deep dive into white fragility, right?
Okay.
So we started by talking about that whole good-bad binary when it comes to racism, like the idea that only the people who are intentionally mean or hateful are the real racists. And DiAngelo, she really pushes back against that. She argues that it lets well-intentioned white people off the hook for their role in keeping racism going.
Right. It lets us avoid any responsibility.
And then we spent some time talking about DiAngelo's definition of white fragility, like how it works as this defense mechanism that actually protects racial inequality. And we talked about specific examples like feeling attacked or blamed when race comes up, or getting all defensive when someone points out the advantages we have from being white. And even like how conversations about race get shut down because they're just too uncomfortable for white people.
Right. It's about centering white comfort above all else.
We also got into that idea of whiteness as property, which was really interesting. That helped us see like all the ways that being white in America comes with all these benefits, these privileges that we don't even think about, but that people of color are often denied. And it's not just about individual people being prejudiced, it's like built into the system itself.
Yeah, it's in the very fabric of our institutions.
And like you were saying earlier, when that system gets challenged, when people start questioning it, it's no wonder folks get so defensive.
It's like you're threatening their whole world.
And of course, we talked about how anti-blackness plays into all of this, right? How it's so deeply rooted in American history and culture that it's almost like a part of what it means to be white in this country. Yeah.
And how we often see those subtle, everyday ways that anti-blackness shows up.
Right, like the all lives matter response to Black Lives Matter, or, you know, that tendency to judge black people way more harshly than white people. And, you know, the way white people often romanticize the past while ignoring all the oppression that black people were facing.
It's a way of erasing history.
And then we ended by looking at some of the ways DiAngelo suggests we can move beyond white fragility.
Right, like starting with being willing to get uncomfortable, being willing to examine our own biases.
It's about educating ourselves on the history of racism, how it continues to affect us today.
And really being intentional about who we listen to, who we build relationships with, making sure we're seeking out those diverse perspectives.
It's about challenging ourselves to get out of our comfort zones and, you know, see the world in a new way.
Right, a more complete way.
And this has been such a thought-provoking conversation. I think it's pretty clear that, like, White Fragility is a book that everyone should read. You know, it doesn't matter your race, your background, like, everyone can learn from it.
Oh, absolutely. It can be, like, a really tough book to read. It's challenging, but it's so insightful. It's so important. It's a call to action for all of us to examine our own part in keeping racial inequality going and to actually do the work of dismantling those systems.
If you're interested in learning more, we've included a link to buy White Fragility in our episode description.
Check it out.
And don't forget to subscribe to the Deep Dive for more, you know, deep dives into all these fascinating and super important topics. Thanks for joining us.